Most people spend their entire lives trying to build something stable, a career that pays the bills, a routine they can count on, a version of themselves that makes sense to the people around them. Emma Fretz, known online as Emma Shaye, had all of that: a full-time job, a small but loyal online following, an identity she'd spent years carefully constructing. And then, one afternoon in October 2024, she handed over money for a collapsing brick building in rural Virginia that nobody had touched in decades and watched every piece of that stability start to shift. The people closest to her didn't know what to say. The internet, however, had a lot to say, just not in the way anyone expected. To understand why this story hits so differently, you have to understand who Emma was before the building entered the picture. Her online handle, Holistic Emma, wasn't a brand name someone cooked up in a strategy session. It was a genuine description of how she lived. Wellness, mindfulness, intentional living, the kind of content that felt earned rather than performed. She wrote about slowing down. She talked about the importance of morning routines. She burned Palo Santo, practiced yoga, meditated. Her platform, across YouTube and Instagram, was built on the idea that how you spend your quiet moments defines everything else. Her YouTube channel had technically existed since 2008, but she posted her first real video in February 2018. For years, she built steadily: lifestyle vlogs, travel content, holistic wellness conversations. By October 2024, after 6 years of consistent posting, she had roughly 1,500 subscribers. That's not a failure. That's a real community of people who actually watched and cared. But it was also a number that gave absolutely no hint of what was about to happen. And then she went to look at a building. The Rose Store, named after its original owner, had been standing in Southampton County, Virginia since the early 1900s. Over a century of life had passed through those walls. At its peak, the building served the surrounding community as both a general store and a post office. Goods came in on freight from the Virginian Railway. Neighbors came in for supplies, for mail, for news. It was one of those places that doesn't just serve a community, it holds one together. But communities shift, traffic dries up, and buildings like this one get left behind slowly, then all at once. By the time Emma found it, the Rose Store had been sitting completely sealed for decades. 4,000 square feet of brick, history, and accumulated silence. Shelves still in place, papers still on the counters. Objects from the early 1900s sitting exactly where someone had left them without knowing it would be for the last time. Emma was 31 years old when she bought it. She'd wanted to own land since she was 18. Not a house in a subdivision, not a condo with a nice view. Land, something she could work with her hands, something she could build into a life. She'd never been particularly interested in the conventional path, the white dress, the Prince Charming, the milestones in the expected order. She'd said so publicly without apology. What she dreamed about was different. And the Rose Store, as impractical and overwhelming and structurally terrifying as it was, looked exactly like what she'd been describing for years. She bought it. Her friends asked if she was going to film it. Her family had questions. She said yes to filming and answered the family questions as honestly as she could. She didn't have all the answers yet. Nobody was prepared for what was inside. When you walk into a building that's been sealed for decades, you're not just dealing with dust and old wood. You're standing in a time capsule that nobody ever intended to create. And the Rose Store turned out to be one of the most remarkable examples of that anyone had documented on camera. Emma found freight receipts from the Virginian Railway Company, physical evidence of how goods arrived at this building when railroad commerce was still the backbone of rural American life. She found correspondence dating back to the early 1900s, ledgers, notebooks, letters, an apothecary bottle from the Norwich Pharmaceutical Company, and then the original receipt for it, and then the crate it came in. She found military photographs that nobody in the building had looked at since the soldiers in them were still young. She shared every single find in real time. No editing for drama, no manufactured reveal. Just a camera pointed at genuine discovery, week after week. Viewers started tuning in not just to watch a renovation, but to watch archaeology. The building wasn't giving up its history reluctantly. It was handing it over piece by piece to someone who clearly understood the weight of holding it. That authenticity was the whole thing. Emma hadn't pivoted into a niche she'd researched for maximum engagement. She'd walked into something real, and the audience could feel the difference. Here's where the numbers become almost impossible to believe. Emma posted her first renovation video on November 25th, 2024. At that point, 1,500 subscribers, years of consistent work, a loyal but small community. Within 4 weeks, that number had more than quintupled. By Christmas Eve 2024, she had 8,300 subscribers. By mid-January 2025, less than 2 months after that first upload, the channel had hit 19,600. TikTok, where she'd been building under the same holistic focused brand, jumped to nearly 50,000 in the same window. Instagram started growing by thousands of followers almost weekly. Eventually, a single video crossed 1 million views. The channel's total view count climbed past 21 million. Instagram settled at 115,000 followers. TikTok landed near 97,500. None of it came from a viral stunt. None of it came from controversy or a dramatic public moment or an algorithm hack. It came from a woman doing genuinely difficult, unglamorous, physically demanding work inside a building that most people would have condemned and walked away from. The growth was a direct reflection of how badly people wanted to watch something that felt unmanufactured. But here's the part that got complicated. The part that created a kind of tension underneath all of it that the subscriber numbers alone couldn't capture. Emma's entire public identity had been built around balance, around self-care, around the idea that your daily rituals are the foundation of everything else you build. That was the philosophy behind Holistic Emma. That was what her community had come to her for. And the Rose store quietly destroyed every single one of those rituals. She wrote about it directly, with the kind of honesty that had always defined her. Before October 2024, yoga was part of every morning without exception. After the purchase, she was stretching for 3 minutes before running out the door. The Palo Santo she'd burned constantly as an anchor for her days sat on a shelf for months, untouched. Meditation, which had been a regular practice, dropped to maybe once a month. She described herself as someone with an all-or-nothing spirit and acknowledged openly that it had taken her far in life, but had also burned her out more times than she wanted to count. The irony was hard to miss. The creator, whose platform was entirely built on intentional living, had thrown herself completely into something that left no room for intention. The wellness influencer had, by her own admission, stopped practicing wellness entirely. What made this land so differently than a typical creator confession was the specificity of the contradiction. This wasn't someone casually mentioning they'd been skipping the gym. This was someone whose entire reason for having an audience was the message that you have to take care of yourself first. Admitting that she'd set that message aside completely. She didn't try to explain it away. She didn't try to rebrand it as a lesson learned. She just said what was true. And somehow that made the audience trust her even more. The physical reality of what she was actually doing also started becoming clearer as the episodes stacked up. And it was not light work. Installing floor joists largely on her own in a 4,000 square foot structure that had been structurally compromised for years, moving massive antique safes without a professional crew, replacing rotted window coverings with plexiglass to bring natural light back into rooms that had been dark for decades, clearing the back lot with a bush hog to prepare the land for septic installation, gardening, and eventually raising chickens. In one episode, she came close enough to serious injury that an ER visit nearly happened. She was transparent about that too, the way she was transparent about everything. Her dad, known to viewers as a regular presence at the property, showed up to help with the heavy work when he could. But most of the time it was Emma, the camera, and whatever the building decided to hand her that day. Zoning requirements, septic regulations for a historic structure, structural decisions with no obvious right answer. The kind of problems that don't have YouTube tutorials because most people never encounter them. She was working her full-time job as a social media manager the entire time, which meant the renovation was limited to roughly 1 day a week. Every episode represented a single day's work inside a project that was going to take years. The business model she built around the discoveries was one of the most quietly brilliant things about the whole operation. Most creators in renovation content treat found artifacts as set dressing, props for a video, then off to storage. Emma did something different. She launched Heritage Row, an online shop named deliberately after the building's original owner family. The name was a choice, not a default. She wanted the history to stay attached to whatever she built. Through the shop, she sold the actual physical artifacts from inside the building. Antique bottles, documents, postal ephemera from the old post office, mystery bags containing random authentic pieces from the store's past, each one different, each one carrying something that had been sitting in those walls since the early 1900s. Buyers weren't purchasing vintage merchandise. They were purchasing a piece of a specific building's specific history, and every dollar went back into the renovation. The building was funding its own restoration through the objects it had been holding onto for a century. That framing connected with people in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss. She also mentioned in her Substack newsletter, the Daffodil Post, the possibility of eventually creating replicas of items she was keeping: bottles, frames, textiles, the kind of objects that carried the aesthetic of Heritage Row beyond the physical building and into something that could exist at a larger scale. Whether that happened or not remained open. But the fact that she was already thinking several moves ahead said everything about how seriously she was treating this as a long-term project, not a content series. There was one moment, buried in a Substack post from mid-2025, that a large portion of her community pointed to as the moment the whole story shifted into something more personal. She mentioned her mom. She wrote about wishing her mom was there to see the homestead, about how her mom had told the kids when they were young to find the dollar homes in Italy and renovate them, about how this project was exactly the kind of thing her mom would have loved. It was a quiet, unannounced piece of grief tucked into a newsletter about renovations and wildflower seeds. And it reframed everything that came before it for people who hadn't been paying attention to what was underneath. This wasn't just a viral renovation series. This was someone doing something that carried a weight the cameras couldn't fully show. By early 2026, Emma was more than 44 documented episodes deep into a project with no clear finish line and no guaranteed outcome. The flower farm and herbal garden she'd envisioned from the beginning were still in the plans. The septic installation, the structural work, the slow room-by-room clearing, all still ongoing. She'd posted a year-in-review compilation that pushed past 77,000 views on TikTok alone. The channel's growth, which had exploded in those first months, had settled into something more durable, a committed audience that showed up every week because they were genuinely invested in whether this woman could pull off something that looked on paper like it probably shouldn't work. The reason the internet can't stop watching isn't complicated once you look at it straight. There is no shortage of renovation content. There is no shortage of female creators doing homestead-adjacent projects. What's rare, genuinely rare, is someone who had an established identity, a coherent brand, a community that trusted her, and who walked away from all of it to do something that didn't fit the brand at all. Not because she planned to, not because a manager suggested it, because she found a 110-year-old building on 1 acre of Virginia land and couldn't say no to it. The question the comments kept asking, can she actually finish this, was never really about the renovation timeline. It was about whether someone could sustain that level of commitment to something this hard, this lonely, and this open-ended without breaking. Her dad is still showing up, the building is still standing, the Daffodil Post is still going out every week to people who want to hold something real in their hands. Emma Shaye made a decision that nobody around her predicted, and she's been living inside the consequences of it ever since. The building that a community had written off is now watched by hundreds of thousands of people across the world who are quietly rooting for the same thing, that someone who chose the harder path over the easier one eventually gets to see what they were building toward all along.